We're very grateful this evening to have with us Spencer W. McBride. As I mentioned, he's an associate managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He has a PhD in history from Louisiana State University. He has been one of the volume editors of Joseph Smith Papers documents, volume 7, 11, and the forthcoming 14. He is the author of Pulpit and Nation, Clergymen and Politics of Revolutionary America. He has written about the evolving role of religion in American politics for the Washington Post, for the Deseret News. He's also the creator and host of The First Vision, a Joseph Smith Papers podcast. He is one of the editors of Contingent Citizens, Shifting Perceptions of Latter-day Saints in American Political Culture, published by Cornell University Press. And that is available for sale here at our store. Unfortunately, because of some problems that we had no control over, we do not yet have the book in that Spencer will be talking about tonight, Joseph Smith for President. We hope to have copies tomorrow, and if the scheduling works out, we'll have signed copies either later this week or the first of next week. So he will be signing his book, but unfortunately we don't have them at the moment. So that's about it for our intro to for this special guest that we have tonight. We're grateful that you've joined us, and be thinking of those questions. And with that, I will turn the time over to our guest author, Spencer McBride.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, and also for Benchmark Books hosting me. I've sat in this store and listened to many great presentations by many great authors and historians, and so it's a privilege for me to be here in the same way. This is the book, Joseph Smith for President. Thankfully I live close, not too far from the store at least, and I'll be down here to sign copies when they come in. I guess, we wish they were here, but sales have been really strong, which I guess is a good problem to have. So I will make sure I sign, and I'll even sign my own name in most of the copies. So yeah, I love this store, and thankful for them hosting me, and hope that you'll support them. And if you haven't got your copy yet, calling them and picking it up here. So we're talking about Joseph Smith and his presidential campaign, and it may seem odd to start a book talk on 1844 Nauvoo politics, Joseph Smith running for president, by invoking Charles Dickens. But that's precisely what I'm going to do, because Dickens wrote one of the greatest opening lines, in my opinion, of just about any book. He started his famous A Christmas Carol this way: Marley was dead, to begin with. And then he spent 3 paragraphs to explain just how dead Jacob Marley was, before coming back to the significance of Marley's status as deceased. And he wrote, "This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate." And this makes sense, because if Jacob Marley had not been dead, there would have been nothing noteworthy about him visiting Ebenezer Scrooge to chat in the middle of the night, save the lateness of the hour. But Marley was dead, which meant he came to Scrooge as a ghost, and that made the story. So, as you know, I wrote a book about Joseph Smith's ill-fated presidential campaign, and as you already probably surmised, he doesn't win. But this is not a book of historical trivia, and it's not simply a book about a little-known, long-shot presidential campaign. Joseph Smith for President is a book about Smith's 1844 bid for the presidency that illuminates the political obstacles to universal religious freedom in 19th century America. So in the spirit of Charles Dickens, there's a purpose to this kind of literary detour. I ask, what fact must be distinctly understood for something wonderful to come from the story I relate in my new book? And that fact is this: the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states before the Civil War and the subsequent passage of the 14th Amendment. Now, this used to be a well-known fact, but it seems forgotten now, either willfully, or as part of our society's worsening case of historical amnesia. But it is true. The Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states before the Civil War. This was partly due to the prevailing constitutional interpretation of the day. The Bill of Rights was adopted to protect the people's rights from encroachment by the federal government, and the preeminence of the states' rights doctrine as a lens through which to view constitutional questions and crises all made it so the Bill of Rights could not be applied by the federal government to the individual states. But this wasn't just interpretation, opinion, and prevailing views of the day, it was also legal precedent. In 1833, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in the case Barron v. Baltimore, in which it explicitly stated the Bill of Rights does not apply to the individual states. The federal government cannot enforce those 10 amendments on the individual states. Then in 1845, 1 year after Joseph Smith is killed, in a case Promoli v. New Orleans, the Supreme Court gets even more specific and rules that the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment does not apply to the individual states. The federal government cannot enforce freedom of religion. And in fact, even after the 14th Amendment makes it so the Bill of Rights does apply to the individual states, it is not until the 1930s and 1940s that the Supreme Court consistently applies the First Amendment protection of religious freedom to the individual states. So why does this matter? Why do I elevate this forgotten fact of American constitutional history to the same level as Jacob Marley being dead? Because changing the Constitution on this very point was the chief reason Joseph Smith ran for president. That is to say that at the heart of Smith's improbable, even quixotic presidential campaign was a quest to protect the rights of religious minorities by implementing significant constitutional reform. But Joseph Smith was not a constitutional scholar. He was not one of the country's great legal minds. He was merely the leader of a religious minority group who recognized from his own lived experience that the Constitution was falling short, that American religious freedom was, in fact, a myth, at least for religious minorities such as the Mormons. And this is a key tension in my book. And so while I think this book will certainly be of interest to a Mormon audience, to those who maybe knew that Joseph Smith ran for president, but know little else about his campaign, I wrote it for a general audience. I wrote it in a narrative style with historical analysis weaved throughout as seamlessly as possible, or at least I did my best. I'll let you, the reader, be the judge. While having a PhD in history certainly provided me the skills I needed to research and write this book, you do not need an advanced degree in history to read and engage with the ideas contained therein. I wrote the book this way because I think that Joseph Smith's presidential campaign needs to be elevated from its status as a fun fact or historical curiosity. It is an indispensable lens through which we can see the political obstacles to universal religious freedom. Yes, religious intolerance, religious persecution is rooted in violence and prejudice. But Joseph Smith was pointing out that there were policies and procedures that on the surface had nothing to do with religion, but in their implementation had a discriminatory effect against minority groups. And so tonight, I'm not going to rehearse every detail of the book. I mean, I already gave away the ending, so I don't know how much more I want to give away. But here are some of the broad contours of the story, hopefully enough to whet your appetite for the book. I have spent years, as I worked on the Joseph Smith papers, working with Joseph Smith's letters, his documents, the mail he left behind, essentially. And I've been asked to do a lot with the political documents. My very first volume as a historian on the Joseph Smith papers was Documents Volume 7. And at the heart of that volume is Joseph Smith's trip to Washington, D.C. in 1839 and 1840. And that's where I begin the book. Joseph Smith, as far as I can tell, was not naturally a political person. And while it was common of the day for politicians to say they were only entering politics because they were called by their country to do so, I believe that Joseph was actually very sincere in saying that he was thrust into the role of engaging with the federal political system only after he and his followers were expelled from Missouri under the threat of state-sanctioned extermination. And so it was in 1839 that Joseph Smith traveled to Washington, D.C. to petition Congress for redress and for reparations. And he met with Martin Van Buren in the White House, not seeking an executive order from Van Buren, but to get his help in petitioning Congress. And Van Buren famously declined. Congress held a special committee hearing prosecutions, not to determine whether or not there should be redress, but to determine, does the federal government have jurisdiction in the case? And they decided no, much to the dismay of Joseph Smith and church leaders. And so what Joseph Smith maybe thought would be one brief foray into federal politics, one quick trip to Washington, D.C., turned into ongoing participation and engagement in the political process for the rest of his life. And they almost perennially sent a petition to Congress. The first one in early 1840, then again in late 1840, in 42, 43, and in 44. They were petitioning Congress. Of course, as they tried to rebuild their lives as religious refugees in Nauvoo, eventually, for a number of different reasons, some external forces and some of the Mormons' own making, the mob violence that had driven them out of Missouri appeared to be rearing its head again in Illinois. And so still seeking redress for what had happened in Missouri, but also seeking protection against a reprisal in Illinois. Joseph Smith famously, at least to those that know the story, in November 1843, wrote a letter to each of the 5 men expected to run for president: Lewis Cass, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Martin Van Buren. Only 3 of them responded: Lewis Cass, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay. Henry Clay was his kind of typical political self, sympathetic, expressed concern for the Latter-day Saints, but ultimately refused to commit. And Cass and Calhoun were sympathetic, but ultimately stated emphatically that the federal government should not be involved, that states' rights was the law of the land and should reign supreme. And so, feeling that they had few other options in the presidential campaign of who to vote for, in January 1844, Joseph Smith accepts the nomination from other church leaders to be an independent candidate for president. And just less than 2 weeks later, working with William W. Phelps, releases a political pamphlet titled General Smith's Views on the Powers and Policy of the Government of the United States. And in it was this radical and in many ways quite progressive campaign platform. He opens it by lamenting that the Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal, yet millions of individuals are enslaved because the color of the skin that covers their souls is different than ours. He calls for the immediate abolition of slavery, but in a very pragmatic way. He calls for it to occur by the federal government purchasing the freedom of the slaves from Southern enslavers. That way they would be compensated for property, and the enslaved men and women and children would be granted their freedom. Paid emancipation was not new, but paid emancipation at this scale and led by the federal government was radical and new. He called for prison reform, for reform of the criminal justice system in general, to get rid of imprisonment for debt, to close the penitentiaries. He saw that the way criminals were treated in prisons was not conducive to actually rebuilding men, and to a lesser extent at that time women, but instead creating a permanent criminal class. He waded into the always contentious, at least at this time, question of the national bank, wanting to establish a third national bank. But this one to Joseph would be different. This one would not enrich investors and shareholders. It would be designed as a public service, with those who ran the bank only receiving $2 a day as their salary. But it would stabilize the nation's economy, end this vicious cycle of extreme booms and busts. He called for territorial expansion, claiming all of Oregon and annexing Texas, and even taking Canada and Mexico eventually, with the caveat, once the Native Americans have given their consent. How serious he was about that, how realistic such a prospect could have even been in his mind is unknown. I wish I could interview him and ask him about that, but that was in his campaign platform. He called for shrinking the size of Congress, yet at the same time, expanding the power of the federal government. And that was at the heart of his political campaign. One issue drove him into the presidential race, empowering the federal government to protect religious minority groups, and by extension, any others hounded by mobs. But he was not a one-issue candidate. But he told famously the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. They are a stink offering in the nose of the Almighty. The states' rights doctrine are what feed mobs. We'll come back to that. And so when I tell people I'm writing a book, or now that I've written a book about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, inevitably there's questions about, well, did he stand a chance? And he didn't. There was no way that a candidate outside the two major parties was going to win enough electoral votes to win this race. The two parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, were so well established at this time that you could not win without the party mechanism or the mechanism of either party. It was a wide open race on the Democrat side, but that did not mean Joseph had a way to slip in and win. That just meant it would take some time for the Democrats to get their candidate. Ultimately, it was James K. Polk. But at the same time, I get the question, was Joseph Smith serious? And I believe he was serious about the campaign. I don't necessarily think he thought he was going to win. There are some lines in some of his letters that suggest that with divine intervention, he might, but only with divine intervention. There were no natural means to such a victory. But even though he may not have thought he could win, he was serious about the campaign. Yes, it served the purpose of a public relations campaign of sorts to raise the profile and awareness of the Latter-day Saints' plight in Missouri and in Illinois. But they also chose electors in every single state. And if you were just running a public relations campaign, you don't pick electors. And in fact, think, for all of you who have voted, how many of you know the electors for whom you voted to vote for your preferred presidential candidate? You don't need electors in a public relations campaign. So this suggests that they were serious about the campaign, even if they didn't necessarily think they were going to win. At the same time, the presidential campaign was not everything. They did not put all their eggs into the presidential campaign basket. It was one of several attempts to get around the main obstacle, as they saw it, to religious freedom in the United States, and that was the states' rights doctrine. And so even as Joseph Smith was running for president, distributing this pamphlet, sending hundreds of electioneering missionaries to campaign for him throughout the country to canvass the nation. The city council is considering other ways around this problem. They petitioned Congress to make Nauvoo a federal city, something like Washington, D.C. So essentially they would secede from Illinois and become a federal city, and thereby get around the states' rights doctrines that were causing them problems. Of course, that petition goes nowhere. They petitioned to make Joseph Smith the head of a 100,000 volunteer army, essentially a general in the United States Army, at a time when the standing army of the United States numbered 8,000 men. He wanted to raise 100,000 men to protect Americans traveling westward. And also, theoretically, if mobs came upon the saints in Nauvoo, he could then lead the army to protect them. They could get around the states' rights doctrine. They also petitioned Congress to grant the Latter-day Saints a liberal tract of land in the West, where they could settle in relative isolation. They're looking at leaving the United States altogether, maybe going to Texas or to California. All these options are on the table. All these irons are on the fire as Joseph Smith is running for president. So yes, he's serious. Yes, the campaign is a serious campaign, even if they know it's a long shot and ultimately futile. But it's not their only hope. It's not their only attempt. Of course, we know how this ends. Or if not, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you. Joseph Smith is assassinated in Carthage jail. To believers, he's martyred. And the caveat here is he is the first presidential candidate assassinated, but he is not assassinated because he was running for president. And as I try to parse it out in the book, what role does his presidential campaign, if any, play in his murder? It was not an immediate cause, but to some in Western Illinois, it did signal what they saw as unbridled ambition. So they didn't kill him to stop him from becoming president. They knew he wasn't going to win, but it was part of this bigger ongoing crisis in which they saw Joseph Smith as a person with limitless ambition who needed to be stopped. And so after Joseph Smith's death, it becomes very apparent to many Latter-day Saints that all these other efforts to get around the states' rights philosophy, the states' rights doctrines, are futile, and their best bet is to leave. And the majority of the Latter-day Saints do leave Nauvoo following Brigham Young, but you know that story. So in wrapping up and leading into question and answer, let me ask this question, which I'll answer myself. Was Joseph Smith right when he said that the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs? I'm going to offer the answer that he was. And I'm going to give an example. Senator David Atchison of Missouri in 1854 wrote to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, on what they were going to do about the abolitionist problem in Missouri. Now, Senator Atchison, about 15 years earlier, had been one of the militia generals who had helped expel the Latter-day Saints from Missouri. He had been one of the more compassionate ones, but still was part of that effort. And now the Mormons, the majority of the Mormons were out in Utah territory. But in 1854, Missouri was facing another unwanted minority group, this time a political minority, the abolitionists. And Missouri was a slave state, and those moving to Kansas, some were also coming to Missouri. What are we going to do about them? That's the point of these letters between Atchison and Jefferson Davis. And this is what David Atchison writes, trying to assuage Jefferson Davis's fears. He says, quote, "We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist." David Atchison had turned Mormonize into a verb, or turned Mormon into a verb that meant shoot, burn, and hang unwanted minority groups to get them out of the state. They had done that to the Mormons in the late 1830s, and they had gotten away with it. And now they felt emboldened and empowered to do it again when there was another unwanted minority group in their state. In this case, at least, the states' rights doctrines did, in fact, feed mobs. But now let me turn the tables on that. Was Joseph Smith right when he believed that just getting rid of the states' rights doctrine and getting squarely under the power of the federal government, that would solve all their problems and they'd have religious freedom? Well, as you may know, when they get to Utah, they are now squarely under the jurisdiction of the federal government, and life did not get easier for them. In fact, we have decades of conflict and tension between the Mormons in Utah and the federal government. So states' rights was not inherently a system of religious discrimination, but it had that effect. And just getting around states' rights did not solve all the problems of prejudice and bigotry that were at play. So, in conclusion, when we talk about the political obstacles to universal religious freedom in 19th century America, as well as in the present, we are not merely talking about a list of overtly discriminatory laws or public policies or philosophies of governance. We are also talking about the way Americans use seemingly neutral policies to enact and maintain discrimination against minority groups. Some do so out of ignorance, unaware of the way their political devotion is abridging the rights of some of their fellow citizens. Some may do so to defend inaction, as a convenient way of claiming that their hands are tied. Still others may use these laws as a thin veil covering their prejudice against one religious minority group or another. Joseph Smith ran for president because he recognized this problem. He fought religious bigotry, but he knew that the fight was against more than religious bigots. The fight was also against the systems of governance that empowered and ultimately protected such bigotry. Through his candidacy, Smith promoted the idea that as important as rooting out prejudice and misunderstanding was to the cause, Americans would never experience true universal religious freedom until they could also address the flaws in their laws and government that maintained and emboldened such systemic inequality. So that's where I'll wrap up. I could talk for hours about it. Anyone who's written a book about a subject is essentially obsessed and can talk forever. But I look forward to chatting with you. So I'm going to go ahead and end my remarks there and start going through the chat. So Stephen asked, what was your motivation for the book? So it's a compelling story, which is nice. Once I started working on the Joseph Smith papers and really dove into Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, and even earlier, his engagement with Martin Van Buren and Congress in 1839 and 1840, I knew a lot of it. At least I knew the broad contours of that story. But my background was not so squarely in Latter-day Saint history, but rather in American political history and kind of the intersections of religion and politics. And so this brought me to look at this Mormon story through what I thought was a broader historical lens, one that took what I knew from my research of religion and politics predating the Mormons and even after. And I wanted to investigate that story and try to get its fuller context. And that ultimately became a driving force in writing this book. And then as I did this kind of larger narrative of religious freedom and political obstacles to it grew and became more prominent in the story I was telling. Right, so Kevin asked, given your background in American political history and all that has been written on this subject, what does this volume add to our understanding of Joseph Smith's candidacy? So there's been some really good research and publications on this topic. I'm by no means the first to write about it. What I hope my book brings is that larger context to understand where Joseph Smith fit in the political story of 1844. The United States was in many ways at a very real turning point. It was a gradual turning point, but they were headed into this, what we know now as the sectional crisis. And Joseph Smith's pleas are coming upon politicians in this context. And so I'm actually quite fascinated by the way that Joseph Smith engaged with some of the leading politicians of the day. And not just understanding what he wrote to them and what they wrote back to him, but understanding why they responded the way that they did. I think it's long been thought, for as just one example, that Martin Van Buren, they were asking Van Buren to issue some executive order to grant Mormons redress in Missouri. And while the Mormons would have taken that, if we read all the documents and we understand the context of what Washington, D.C. is like at this time, we see that no, they're really asking Martin Van Buren to advocate for the Latter-day Saints, and specifically in his, what we know today, the State of the Union address, his message to Congress. There is this obsession in the Mormons' letters to one another and back home to Nauvoo from DC about the State of the Union address. Yes, they were upset that Van Buren hadn't promised them, but he had said he'd reconsider. And so they kept on saying, hey, he has, and this was back when the speech was published in the newspapers, and they kept on writing back to Nauvoo, hey, we haven't seen it yet, we haven't seen it yet, but we hope he says something. And then once he says nothing, then we get Joseph Smith unleashing his vitriol on Martin Van Buren. And so that's one aspect where we can look at what was Van Buren's motivation. I don't think Martin Van Buren was necessarily deeply prejudiced against the Mormons. I'm not saying he was, pro-Mormon, but he also was thinking as a calculating politician. That drove his response to Joseph Smith and Company. And so that's one area that I hope my book kind of expands, a story that so many love and are interested in. So Paul asked, I take your point that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states before the 14th Amendment, but can you then say how the Bill of Rights did function before the 14th Amendment? Yeah, that's a good question. So essentially the Bill of Rights was designed to protect the people from having their rights abridged by the federal government. And so if the federal government made a law concerning religion, one could sue in federal court, presumably, and have that law revoked. It was designed to protect the people's rights. And as many constitutional scholars will write, it kind of comes out of this era of the Revolution where the revolutionaries were worried about a distant foreign government, right? Parliament and the king had been a distant government. They believed that the people's rights were best secured by the states. And so more power was given to the state constitutions. Interestingly enough, Missouri had a clause in its state constitution at the time of the expulsion of the Mormons guaranteeing religious freedom. In this case, Joseph Smith is saying when states fail to protect religious minority rights, the federal government needs to be empowered to do so. There's something wrong with the Constitution if we can be expelled under threat of state-sanctioned extermination and the federal government says our hands are tied. And so, yeah, it was really designed to protect the people from having the federal government encroach upon their rights. But then with the 14th Amendment, that changes the way that the Bill of Rights is interpreted and applied. Paul, I hope I answered that adequately. If not, you know where to find me. Kevin, forget my early question. Oh, sorry, I already answered your earlier question, I guess twice now. How does states versus federal power arguments from Joseph's day inform the debate about the same today? In the same vein, how does the religious freedom argument in Joseph's day inform the same today? Really good question. Yeah, I don't think Joseph Smith was teaching. In many ways, Joseph Smith's political thought, his political publications are products of the time. He is essentially saying there's something wrong with the system as it exists now and as we exist in it in this moment. He's not, and it's interesting, he's calling for a smaller federal government as he's calling for a more powerful federal government. He's not saying states' rights should be abolished entirely, but that the federal government should ultimately have supremacy in this kind of divided, the system of divided sovereignty. And in that way, that's still, in many ways, a live debate in politics today, though the 14th Amendment and the Civil War have given the federal government an upper hand, I think, ever since. And I'll say, with Joseph's, one more thing on Joseph Smith's political thought. In many ways, it was reactionary to what was going on, but also probationary in that he believed the millennium was imminent and that eventually all this was not going to matter so much. In fact, the Council of 50, there's a lot of talk about the establishing theodemocracy, the government of the millennium. And so there's a certain sense that this is all going to be probationary. In the same vein, how does the religious freedom argument in Joseph's day inform the same today? Now, this is really interesting because I think there are times where states' rights can become today about religious freedom, or it can find itself informing who has religious freedom and who doesn't. The federal government can try to protect the rights of all minority groups in the United States, and individual states can still try to pass laws that are discriminatory, and then that leads to legal battles today, and we see that playing out. But I think what Joseph Smith maybe didn't realize or couldn't have until he saw the Latter-day Saints experience after his death was that it wasn't, states' rights wasn't inherently about religious freedom, but this policy that was clearly used to suppress enslaved people, to keep them enslaved, also had a discriminatory effect in its application against the Latter-day Saints. I raised it, and when we talk about religious freedom today, is as an example of, are there laws, are there policies, are there political ideas that we support that on the surface have nothing to do with religion, but in their implementation have a discriminatory effect? It's a call for us to be reflective, to be self-examining, to examine our ideas, our politics. We may not think that we are prejudiced. We may not think that we support bigotry, but maybe we inadvertently do. And maybe there are others that are disingenuously using these policies to cover real bigotry and real prejudice. It's a call for individual and collective self-examination. So Greg asks, how, if at all, did Joseph Smith's faith influence his platform or campaign, aside from his experience as the leader of a religious minority group? So religious rhetoric is throughout Joseph Smith's campaign statements. At one point, he says that Congress, to a letter to John C. Calhoun, I believe, says that Congress with the president as its executor should be as sovereign, I'm going to mangle this quote, as sovereign in its sphere as Jehovah is in his. He's calling for, in the Council of 50, he's calling for theodemocracy in the Council of 50, but even in an editorial, he's calling for this idea of the people, or the people assenting to the voice of God. My fellow historian, who I believe is in here, Ben Park, has written extensively on this in his book. That's where we really see it, is in the Council of 50, and then parts of what's discussed in the Council of 50 leak out into some of these editorials. And theodemocracy is the real part, this idea of democracy being merged with what people would call outright theocracy. And then I'll say this, on a practical level, Joseph Smith had one advantage that most outside candidates like him did not have. He had a ready core of experienced missionaries who could quickly go use their missionary experience to become electioneers. And in that sense, the religious structure of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints gave Joseph Smith an edge that other third-party candidates did not have. You guys are asking these faster than I can answer, but keep them coming. Jared asks, what were the core religious practices that led to conflict and desire to run for the presidency? What role, if any, did polygamy play in Joseph's reasons to run for presidency? What role did the Council of 50 play in the presidential bid? And did an assassination attempt on Governor Boggs play any role in Joseph's political aspirations? Okay, so the first question, what were the core religious practices that led to the conflict? This is going back to Missouri and then again in Illinois. And the objections of the Latter-day Saints critics were to their religious practices were almost always intertwined with political, economic, and social concerns. They would call this a pretend religion and say they are exercising too much political and economic power by gathering together, right? It was never just pretend religion, as they would call it. It was a pretend religion, a pretend prophet who is exerting political and social power. It was that combination, at least in the stated reasons they gave. That was in Missouri and again in Illinois. What role, if any, did polygamy play in Joseph's reasons to run for presidency? Now, this is a tricky one. Polygamy doesn't play a big role in the presidential campaign. It's not a key feature. It's not a key motive. Polygamy is a factor in the political culture of Nauvoo. It is the subtext of much of what's happening in the city council and in the political culture of Nauvoo, not necessarily on the national stage. Some have joked, if Joseph had won, how many first ladies would there have been? But at this time, there were rumors of polygamy. There were people who were adamant that the Mormons were practicing polygamy and wanted to drive them out, but they were still primarily rumors. What role did the Council of 50 play in the presidential bid? Now, the Council of 50 was not created to make Joseph Smith president. Its first meetings were about the potential of moving the Mormons to Wisconsin or to Texas. The group in Wisconsin had written a letter to Joseph Smith, and that led the question about, do we move to Texas? Do we move elsewhere? And then it grew into this political council. And that, as a political council, the Council of 50 played a major role in many aspects of managing Joseph's campaign. Who do we select as vice president to run on his ticket? What are the policies and platforms? How do we help the Quorum of the 12 get started with the electionary missionaries? Let's talk about our constitutional theories and what theodemocracy is. In that sense, the Council of 50 is integral to the presidential campaign, but it wasn't created for the presidential campaign. And did the assassination attempt on Governor Boggs play any role in Joseph's political aspirations? Again, I don't think Joseph wanted to be president because of this political aspiration, this megalomaniac type desire to gather all power unto himself. It was out of desperation that he sought the presidency. But the attempted assassination attempt on Governor Boggs and the second extradition attempt that followed very much fueled the situation in Illinois. The laws that they passed in Nauvoo, the habeas corpus ordinances that they amended, all comes out of this second extradition attempt. Let's protect Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. They bring all this extraordinary power to the Nauvoo city government, and that further fans the flames of anti-Mormon animosity. As does their sometimes botched attempts at block voting. Ben asked, how involved do you believe Joseph Smith was in crafting his platform? Now, this is a tough question, and anyone who's worked with Joseph Smith's papers, and especially the Nauvoo era papers, will know it is really hard to separate Joseph Smith from William W. Phelps in a lot of these writings. And for some Latter-day Saints, they use this as a convenient almost scapegoat, right? If something is published in Joseph's name and that we don't like it, let's just say Phelps wrote it, and that gives us kind of a cop-out, but it's not so simple. Ghostwriting isn't someone simply writing something and then Joseph signing his name to it. It wasn't like that then, it wasn't like that now. And so Phelps, you can see some turns of phrases and some literary style that's clearly Phelps in that pamphlet. And I suspect that some of the ideas are fleshed out with Phelps's political acumen. But I think we still see Joseph Smith in almost every single one of those platform planks. Every part of his platform was nationally relevant, but also personally relevant. He had been in jail. His father had been cast into debtor's prison. That was a personal topic to him, as well as a nationally relevant topic. Territorial expansion was very relevant as they were considering leaving the United States. Slavery was a pressing question in the church. The church it didn't forbid slavery. There were slave owners in the church. But it was a pressing question, and it had caused schisms in other churches. This was relevant to Joseph personally. So the ultimate answer, and this is the ultimate academic way of saying I don't know, is you give a long answer of what you do know and then repeat I don't know. But that is kind of the open question, right? How much of this platform is Phelps? How much of it is Smith? I don't think we can ever know, but I'll say Smith is definitely in it, and so is Phelps, and Smith ultimately approves of it. But it's kind of this question that, man, I would love to have a sit-down interview with both Joseph Smith and William W. Phelps and kind of say, well, whose idea was this line and this line and this line? So yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I could solve it. I'm no closer now than I was when I started the project. Thanks, Ben. Jace asks, How is the campaign received by non-Mormon voters, if at all? Do we know how other candidates received Joseph's bid? Yeah, largely it was seen as a curiosity. Many dismissed it out of hand. Others used it as a point of mockery. Let's laugh at the Mormons. Let's laugh at Joseph Smith. And then there was another group that they might take Joseph Smith's platform seriously only to kind of throw stones at their longstanding political rivals. So Joseph Smith's claims about ending slavery was taken up by the free labor movement in the North, who were looking to secure worker rights for working white men before you freed slaves. So there was this ongoing debate between the abolitionists and those working for white men's labor rights of which one was more important and a higher priority. And they invoked Joseph Smith's platform, not in a way of taking Joseph Smith seriously, but in a continuing to fight one another. But even in mockery, you can see some sense of what these people feared. They did not think that Joseph Smith was a serious contender. But even in mocking him, they used it as a chance to kind of raise a warning of, we need to be careful not to mix religious leadership with secular and political leadership. That was a dangerous combination. So even as they mocked Joseph Smith, they issued serious warnings that this is a dangerous combination. Great question. Can you talk about Joseph sending men on missions to campaign for him? What was their reaction to him using them in this way? If there was any group of would-be voters that believed Joseph Smith could win, and some even thought that he would win, it was the electioneering missionaries. There was an eagerness among many of them. Some of them didn't feel very comfortable preaching politics. And so for many of them, they just went and they preached the gospel as they had as missionaries, believing that if I convert someone, that's a vote for Joseph Smith, the same as if I convince them politically to vote. And so there was, for many of them, an eagerness to go about and preach politics. And there's some great stories in the book from this, including what happens when you go into the southern states with a pamphlet calling for the end of slavery, when most of these states have laws that claim it's illegal to even distribute literature that is anti-slavery. And many of the Latter-day Saints, especially in Tennessee, run into this problem. You'll have to read the book to get that full story, but it's fascinating. And how do some slave states react to Joseph Smith's pamphlet differently than others? Kentucky and Tennessee being two examples. One last thought just crossed my mind on the previous question about how do non-Mormons respond. One of my favorite letters is by Daniel H. Wells, who was in Nauvoo at the time, was not yet a Mormon. And he writes to his father saying, "You'll see by the papers that Joseph Smith has decided to run for president," and kind of tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of sarcasm, because who would want to live in a city without a presidential candidate? And can you really consider a city great if it doesn't have a presidential candidate? But then he goes on to essentially assuage his father that this is a lark, that ultimately the Mormons will come around to vote for Harry of the West, or what they call the name they use for Henry Clay. You seem to state that Matt asks, you seem to state that Joseph's goal in running was religious freedom. However, the Council of 50 Minutes, wasn't it clear he was trying to build a theocracy outside of the United States? Can a theocracy exist within the framework of the Constitution? Joseph Smith thought that it could, although there would have to be some adjustment to the Constitution. And a key part of what we see in the published Council of 50 Minutes is this effort to rewrite the Constitution and create a theocracy or theodemocracy, as they would have called it. And Joseph Smith thought that he had found a way that reconciled democracy, the best parts of democracy, and theocracy. Now, it's up for each person to decide whether or not he was right. It's hard to know what a theodemocracy would have looked like in practice. We only kind of get this rough sketch in these debates of what it would look like theoretically. But Joseph Smith believed that you could merge the two. He believed that it could lead to religious freedom, though clearly the Mormons in this in the theocracy that he envisioned would have a preeminent role, and him as prophet, absolutely. He tried to signal symbolically by including a few non-Mormons, probably, you could easily criticize as token non-Mormons in the Council of 50, as it's not all for Mormons. But yeah, it's an open question, right? He's fighting for religious freedom, but he's also thinking about leaving. And this is the precarious state of Joseph Smith and the Mormons at this time. Even as they're thinking of leaving and starting their own government, they're looking for ways to stay and make it work. And even what if most of us leave and we keep Nauvoo as a kind of a city, but the majority of the saints are elsewhere? There are open options on the table, and they're exploring them all simultaneously. But yet Joseph Smith believed that he could find a way that theocracy as a theodemocracy could kind of take the best of both worlds. But it was all theoretical, and it was all debated. And that's what we have in the minutes, is a bunch of debates spelling out this vision, but never clearly stating it or implementing it. At least not in Nauvoo under Joseph Smith. All right, Chris asks, conspiracy lore says that Joseph Smith was killed because some were afraid he would be elected. Is there any truth to this? I don't see any evidence that Joseph Smith was killed to stop him from becoming president. In as much as his campaign influenced his eventual murder, it was because it suggested that he was that his ambition knew no bounds. But some have suggested, some previous literature suggested that it was also a Whig conspiracy. Not that Joseph Smith would be elected, but that he would draw enough votes away from Henry Clay that Henry Clay would not be elected. Essentially, that Joseph Smith would cost Henry Clay the election. That's why he was assassinated. I found no evidence that supports that. How did Joseph stand out in the 1844 presidential field? I mean, he is one of these outside candidates, and he wasn't the only one. James G. Birney was a third-party candidate running for the Liberty Party on a one-issue ticket, that is the immediate abolition of slavery. He wasn't going to win either, but he got enough votes to steal or to push New York State out of the Whig column and push it into Polk's column and lead to a Democratic victory. And so many looked at James G. Birney not as a serious contender himself, but as a wild card game changer in the main election. And so no one saw Joseph Smith, outside of Nauvoo and the electioneering missionaries, saw Joseph Smith as a serious contender. But there seems to be, they sent men to the Whig and Democratic conventions in Baltimore. We don't know exactly what those men were charged to do, but it seems that they had the liberty to try to see if they could get one of these candidates in either party to ultimately promise to help the Mormons, or at least to push their agenda, their platforms, to incorporate things that would be favorable to help the Mormon situation in Illinois. Are we good to keep going?
Yeah, skip mine
and
whoever.
Okay. Laura Campbell asks, did any of the competing candidates have the same main cause as Joseph Smith, expand federal government to protect minorities? Neither of the main candidates did, but this is one of the really interesting things I discovered that I wish I had an answer for, and I still don't. James G. Birney, in his campaign platform, calls for the federal government to do more to stop mob violence, and specifically mentions the Mormons as one such case. So Joseph Smith wanted a presidential candidate to take up the Mormons' cause as part of their campaign. The one who did it was James G. Birney, and there seems to be no documented acknowledgement by Joseph Smith that this was there. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he knew, but Birney was an outside candidate like him and not good enough. I'm not sure. But James G. Birney did take up this idea, at least of doing something to stop the mob violence that was so prevalent. Jace asks, are there any questions about the campaign that you had which you were unable to find an answer for? All right, so there's the James G. Birney one. Yeah, one that still kind of sticks in my mind relates to the vice presidential search. They're searching for a candidate to run for president or vice president with Joseph Smith. And they ask James Arlington Bennett of New York, and there's some questions about where he was born. They believe that he was foreign born. And so they move on because they think he's ineligible to be vice president. Only after they've moved on did they find out that James Arlington Bennett actually was born in the United States and was eligible, but he had let this lie, this false story continue because it helped him more easily get a copyright in the United Kingdom if they thought he was born in Ireland. So he just didn't correct the misinformation. But by then they'd moved on. And this is the question in my mind. They turned to Solomon Copeland, who is a state assemblyman in Tennessee, so not a big national political figure, very friendly to the Mormons, a close friend of Wilford Woodruff from his time as a missionary there. Solomon Copeland's wife had converted and become a Latter-day Saint, and two of the slaves, two of the men that they had enslaved, were also Latter-day Saints. And I have to thank Paul Reeve, who's on here, because it was him. He was the one who pointed me through his Century of Black Mormons database to these Copeland slaves who had joined the church. And so the question that sticks in my mind is Joseph Smith calls for the end of slavery, and he invites an enslaver to be on his ticket with him. And I don't know how he made that work in his mind. And one possible way is, well, if he Joseph maybe thought that the enslavers in the South wanted to be rid of slavery, but it was not economically viable. And so maybe his campaign platform, his plan of paid emancipation would take care of that, and Copeland would be grateful. I don't know. That's just an idea I've turned around in my head a lot. That's one of those questions that I wish I knew the answer to, and I don't, is how Joseph, rectified it in his mind that he was running an anti-slavery campaign, and he invited an enslaver to be on his ticket. Of course, they never hear back from Copeland, and ultimately they're running out of time, and Sidney Rigdon is chosen. Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith had a rocky, on again, off again relationship at this time. This was in an on again moment that Sidney Rigdon agrees to be on the ticket. The next question, the financial crisis of 1837, which affected the Saints in Kirtland, was in part the result of the anti-bank policies of Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren continued these policies to the detriment of the country. Were financial policy considerations part of Joseph's reasons for running for president? Absolutely. We get some of that in General Smith's views, his campaign pamphlet, but where we get the most is in this letter he writes to Francis Blair, the Democratic Party operative who was the very influential editor of the Washington Globe, of that newspaper. And he mocks Joseph's idea of the new national bank. And it's in his rebuttal to Blair that we get Joseph's views on the sub-treasury, which was a financial policy put forward by Van Buren, for instance. Joseph Smith rarely comes after Andrew Jackson. He readily comes after Martin Van Buren. And even though many of Van Buren's policies were an outgrowth or even identical to Jackson's policies, even though the expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri had happened under Jackson's presidential administration, and his administration refused to help the Saints too, Joseph seems to separate Jackson from Van Buren, and he's very easy on Jackson, very hard on Van Buren. But this is also a pressing issue for Joseph Smith because much of Illinois at this time and much of the country was incredibly cash poor. There was so little cash at Nauvoo that a lot of the Nauvoo citizens were getting by bartering. And it wasn't just Nauvoo. The Illinois State Bank had failed. There was not enough reliable currency going around. So these were all very pressing issues. But if you want to get into more of his details, rather than looking at the campaign pamphlet, look at this letter to Francis Blair, which is discussed in the book, of course. Okay. Was Joseph Smith anointed as king of the world, and how accurate and credible are the sources that this practice continued at least to John Taylor? Do we know when this ordinance and practice ceased? If ever, was his anointed as king of the world related to his platform combined theocracy and democracy? So this is a big question. I probably don't have a fully satisfactory answer. We read in the Council of 50 Minutes that there was an anointing of Joseph Smith as a prophet, priest, and king. What exactly that means in that situation, there's a lot that it could mean. It could be related to theocracy, absolutely. It could be related to other ordinances that were coming forth in Nauvoo at this time. At the end of the day, I don't know for sure. I'm not a skilled theologian necessarily, more interested in the history, and others could probably speak to this particular question better than I can. I don't feel like I've come to a clear answer of what that anointing in the Council of 50 meant. And so I'm going to punt on this, acknowledging that that's what I'm doing, because I don't know. And in fact, I bet you get into this conversation in a lot of groups, you're going to get a lot of different answers of what this means. And I don't know if mine is any better than others, or if I can say it with absolute confidence. So yes, I'm punting, but yeah, that's why. I hope that's okay. And you guys are asking great questions. I really appreciate it. I hope that this is a sign that this is an interesting choice of a subject, and something that you guys will dive into. And one other question here up above that Chris had asked about Sidney Rigdon. Okay, and I mentioned a little more of this. This is fascinating because Sidney Rigdon leaves Nauvoo to go to Pennsylvania, his native state, to reestablish his residency so he can be a vice presidential candidate, so that they can be running from different states. Again, if this was just for public relations, does it actually matter that the vice presidential candidate is eligible to run for president? And I don't think it does. So I think it's another sign that there was seriousness on the Mormons' side. Even if they didn't think they could win, they were running a serious campaign. Of course, and this is going to sound like an obvious and silly statement. There's no good time to be murdered by a mob, right? Duh. But the timing of Joseph Smith's murder was about as inconvenient for the church and for the citizens of Nauvoo as possible, because 10 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were out of Nauvoo campaigning. A lot of the leading church, or a lot of the church leaders, were out campaigning. They were away from Nauvoo because of the political campaign. If not for the political campaign, they would have still been in Nauvoo. Would that have changed things? I don't know. That'd be an alternate history, not really what historians do. But it fundamentally affected the aftermath of the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith. It's something to consider. And many of them didn't hear the news until weeks later. And if you look at the Willard Richards papers that are in the collection of in the church archives, in fact, these ones are digitized and in the church catalog, you see the letter that Willard Richards wrote from Nauvoo to Emma Smith, wrote from Carthage jail to Emma Smith and others, essentially telling them what happens, telling them that Joseph and Hiram are dead. Don't attack Carthage or we won't be protected. And then one of the very next letters he wrote that we still have is a letter to Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12, asking them to come home, telling them that the time for politics is done. It's time to come back to Nauvoo. By the time that letter reached, and other letters from Nauvoo reached Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12, most of them had already heard and were beginning to make their way back. It's a kind of the tragic aftermath of this story. And the Latter-day Saints did plan to hold a national nominating convention in Baltimore. And even though their candidate was dead, a very small group of electioneering missionaries on the appointed day met in Baltimore for their nominating convention. But rather than nominate Joseph Smith for president, they mourned the death of their beloved prophet and chose a preferred candidate by an unruly mob. And maybe that's the best place to wrap it up, if there's no other questions that I missed or pressing questions. Oh, yes. So I'm going to turn it back over to the bench.
Well, that was fabulous. And no one can accuse Spencer of not knowing his subject. He's done more on this than most of us could even imagine. I want to show you the book again and announce the very good news that this book from such a prestigious press is Oxford University Press, that often has high prices on its books. This hardbound book, well bound and everything, with a dust jacket, is only $29.95. So it's a bargain. So we will have signed copies in the very near future. So please order from us either by phone or email. And we really appreciate Spencer taking his time and coming to be with us tonight. And thank you for your attendance. And again, we look forward to the time when we can do these in person once again. So we wish you well. Have a good night.